Thank you for joining me on this episode of Teach Me. Today, I am joined by Dr. Timothy Wright, who does research on birds and the behavior and social interactions on birds. So, Dr. Wright, you've done research on the behavior and social interactions of birds with a focus on their communication. So, could you teach me a bit about your research on how birds communicate?
Sure, Jeremiah. Thanks for having me, and I'm happy to talk about my favorite thing, the science that I do. So,
Thank you for being here.
yeah. So, I think with science, the very most fundamental thing is, and this was taught to me early by my graduate student advisor, is the importance of asking a good question that leads you in interesting directions. And so. Yeah. When I was an early graduate student, my mentor, Jack Bradbury, said to me, he said, well, we know a lot about how I wouldn't say a lot, but we know that parrots are really good at mimicking human voices in captivity. We know that they can sort of talk, it seems. We don't know anything about how they're using that in the wild. We don't know why that ability might have evolved in the first place. So why don't you study that, he said. And that was a big, broad question. Why can parrots talk? Why have they evolved that ability? Yeah. And it's basically sustained my whole career since then, asking this question in different ways. So one of the exciting things about animal behavior is that you can take a simple question like that and think about it at different levels. So you can think about why parrots talk in terms of what benefit it gives to an individual to be able to mimic or to learn vocalizations. Mm-hmm. You can think about how that evolved over time. So what's the evolutionary history? Do parrots have something special or some special adaptations that allow them to learn? You can think about it at what we might call the mechanistic level of sort of thinking about the brain and sensory abilities. How is it that parrots are able to what is it about parrot brains that are especially good at asking that? So I've pursued a lot of those different questions through the years, and the techniques, how we address those questions can really vary quite a bit. So my first work was very much trying to understand what they're doing in the wild. So when I was a grad student, I drove my Volkswagen van from San Diego down to Costa Rica and traveled around and recorded the parrots as they came into big communal night roosts where they slept at night. And that was to try to understand whether parrots in different regions might have different vocalizations or different calls. What we had been previously found in songbirds that learn, and they were called vocal dialects there, sort of much as humans have dialects in different regions of the United States or different countries. And so we were curious whether the parrots might have the same. And at first, I was driving around this one region and going to these night roosts, and they all sounded about the same. They sounded like wah, 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 wah. And then, it sounded sort of ridiculous, right? Yeah. Parrots are capable of saying all these remarkable things and even singing and such when you bring them into captivity. But in the wild, they sort of sound like ducks or something. And then we continued, we expanded our range, and we went a little farther south in Costa Rica, and they sounded completely different. They sounded like weep, weep, weep. And these were birds that looked exactly the same. They were doing the same thing. They were coming into the night roost and calling to each other in a very similar manner, but the vocalizations were completely different. And that was a big eureka moment for me.
Yeah, I was going to say, that sounds interesting.
Yeah. No, it was, I mean, I can remember as if it was yesterday when I first heard these birds that I've been listening to for several months, sounding all the same in one region and then going completely different. If I'd been blindfolded, I wouldn't have said that was the same species. Yeah, that's how different it was. So I've continued working in Costa Rica with that particular species of parrots for the next 20 years. We continue to work with them now. I'm going down to Costa Rica in a couple of weeks to visit them, in part because we've done lots of different studies. So one thing we've done is gone back every 11 years and resurveyed over these roosts and tried to ask, are these dialect differences consistent over time? Yeah. And the answer has been really interesting. At first, the answer was yes. Oh, wow, these seem really stable. After the first 11 years, The calls sounded very similar and they had the same boundaries. Then we went back 11 years later in 2016. So 22 years after I originally recorded them. And the 11 years is not purposeful. It's just that I don't quite get it together to go every 10 years or something. Yeah. So every 11 years. And we went back and there were lots of new vocalizations, different sounding vocalizations, and regions that had been one type were sort of switching to another. And we think that change in the vocalizations is indicative of some serious social disruption with the species. So we've documented when we go around recording at these different roosts, we also count the number of birds that come in just to get a sense of what population sizes are. And we've seen a very precipitous decline in the species. It's gone from being fairly common to it's just been upgraded to critically endangered.
Yeah, I was going to say that could have been a factor in it, or deforestation, climate change, something like that. That was the first thing that my mind went to when you said the thing about the language or the vocalizations changing.
Yeah. Well, we humans are changing the earth so rapidly that there are a lot of potential answers for it. But we think that the most direct answer is probably the one certainly there's been habitat change in those parts of Costa Rica, and forests have been cleared for high intensity farmland like sugarcane and rice farming. Yeah. But probably the biggest impact has been people capturing them for pets, for the pet trade, both within Costa Rica and then potentially selling them outside of Costa Rica. We've documented time and time again nest poachers doing that. So that has been a big impact on that species, and it's impacted their vocalizations and how we study them to a certain extent. We're focusing a little bit more on conservation now than we did initially because it didn't seem like that was strictly necessary.
And how are you going about doing that?
Well, conservation is both a science and a social science. So there are questions to be asked about how best to do conservation, but a lot of it is, and there's information to be gained about where populations are being lost or what's nesting success. Is there certain types of habitats that they nest in better than others? So I'm working with a Costa Rican student whose name is Nacho Vargas, and he is working on these questions. But also part of it is working with communities and trying to convince people to leave the parrots alone, or else there's not going to be any parrots. Yeah. And part of it's sort of governmental, trying to convince the government of Costa Rica to actually enforce the laws that they now have on the books that say that poaching parrots is illegal. So yeah. It's work that we do with a lot of partners. We have we work with an organization called the World Parrot Trust. That's a sort of an international parrot conservation organization. Mm-hmm. We work with students in Costa Rica, and we work with conservation organizations in Costa Rica that also work to protect parrots. And then we work with the government agencies that protect large areas of land and sort of manage land. Yeah. So these are people that I've worked with now 30 years, and so I know pretty well. So they're 100% on board with trying to protect these parrots. So
yeah, it makes complete sense too. That's one of my passions, just in general, just nature, conservation, that type of thing. So hopefully, fingers crossed that everything works out with it. Cause it's always sad to see, because there's so many animals and even plants that are the numbers are declining just so rapidly. And it's there used to be so many variations, and even now there's still a lot, but when you compare that to what used to be, it's wild to see.
It is alarming, and it's been particularly so for working with this one species. This is the one that I first started working on as a baby graduate student, fresh out of undergrad, and worked on them for my entire career. And to see them going from being fairly common to being not just endangered, but critically endangered, yeah. is sort of a kick in the stomach, really, when I heard that. And it's spurred me on to try to do more work in that conservation arena than I had been.
Yeah, that is definitely probably a journey, because you've been around from the peaking and now going down, but then hopefully all the conservation efforts and education, research, all that type of stuff, it sounds like you also have a network of people to be able to try and help you basically revive the population, and hopefully everybody's getting on board with it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, people are people, so sometimes there are rivalries, and a couple people want to do the same thing. But I think we're getting it sorted out so that we can do the most for the most populations down there. So that's been good. But we also continue to work on vocal communication in parrots, not just with that species, but in the lab. We do some neurobiology where we're actually trying to look at what genes are active in the brains during learning. We do behavioral work with small groups of animals. We sometimes play back calls and see how they respond to different versions of vocalization. So get back to original question, there's lots of different tools that we use to try to understand why parrots can talk.
How do you go about tracking the, you said the neuro, how do you go about tracking something like that for vocalization?
So the types of genes we're interested in are ones that sort of modulate vocal learning over longer periods, so they're not instantaneous. Some people do neurobiology where they're actually looking at specific nerves firing, what's termed electrophysiology. Haven't done too much of that, and haven't done any of that in my lab. Instead, what we're interested in is if we've got older birds or younger birds, do we see differences in these certain genes that have been actually genes that were first discovered in humans? It's a gene called FOXP2 that was found to be associated with a family in England that had inherited speech difficulties, what's called dyspraxia. And so members of that family, there's actually very touching YouTube videos from members of the KE family, as they were originally known, talking about how difficult it is to have this. They've got a large deletion in this FOXP2 gene that renders it unfunctional. And they talk about how difficult it is to go through life not being able to communicate very clearly. It's really a touching, moving reminder of how important language is for us. So this gene was first discovered in humans, and then subsequently people found it in songbirds that are capable of vocal learning, and we mapped its changes in budgergar, so a small parrot, the pet store parakeet that we use. Now, I won't lie, that work does involve taking the brains from individuals, so we do sacrifice them, painlessly euthanize them, and then look at gene levels in the brains after taking them out. So it's difficult work to do in that we are sacrificing some individuals, but my view is that we are learning some very important things about learning and about how both juveniles and adults can learn. And so that work is potentially beneficial to humans, potentially even to humans like the KE family has that speech loss.
That's really cool. And also the research that can relate to from animals into humans and back and forth, like interchangeably. But
yeah, that's one of the neat things about this story is this is a gene that was first discovered in humans, studied in animals because you can't manipulate human brains. And then we can then hopefully take what we can learn back to humans and maybe address not just people with speech dyspraxia, but also autism and other things.
That sounds really cool. But thank you for sharing with me your research and deep breadth of knowledge on bird communication, their social interactions, behavior, all the different types of stuff that you do. It's all really cool. And I hope that you also enjoyed this episode of Teach Me with Dr. Wright. You can listen to the next episode of Teach Me next Wednesday. But thank you for joining me on this episode, and stay tuned for more content. Follow me on Instagram and TikTok, and make sure to follow me on Apple and Spotify podcasts and give me a 5-star rating if you enjoyed. Thank you so much.